Captain Adrian Volkov was a man whose name carried weight across the barracks. Not because of honor or admiration, but because of fear. He had the medals, the commendations, the ribbons that glittered proudly on his chest. And for outsiders, he was a symbol of discipline and strength. To the world beyond the gates of the base, he was a decorated officer who had served in several campaigns, a man who wore the uniform with pride and authority. But those who lived under his command knew a different man, one whose iron fist was far heavier than the medals that adorned him. The younger soldiers whispered his name only in private, careful never to let their voices carry through the thin walls of the sleeping quarters. They knew his footsteps, the sharp, deliberate strike of polished boots against concrete that sent hearts racing and backs straightening before he even entered the room. He demanded silence with his presence alone, and when he spoke, his words were often laced with venom. Pathetic. He would sneer if a soldier's bunk wasn't perfectly aligned. Do you call yourself protectors of this nation? I've seen more discipline in children. His punishments were never just scolding. They were humiliations designed to break spirit and pride. There was the time Private Keller, barely 18, stumbled during a morning drill. Instead of a correction, Captain Volkov forced him to march in circles around the compound for hours. Under the blazing sun, without water. Other soldiers dared not intervene. They stood watching, silent, knowing that the slightest attempt to help would invite the captain's wrath upon them. Another time, Sergeant Moreno, a seasoned soldier respected by many in the unit, questioned one of the captain's orders. Volkov's response was swift and merciless. A public dressing down so cruel that Moreno, a man who had endured years of combat, lowered his head in shame before the entire battalion. After that, even the boldest of men held their tongues. The captain thrived on this silence. He mistook obedience born of fear for respect, and control born of cruelty for loyalty. In his eyes, he was untouchable. His uniform was armor, his rank a shield against reproach. He carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed rules were for others, not for him. The soldiers carried their wounds quietly. At night, whispers passed between bunks when they were sure the captain was nowhere near. Some spoke of leaving, others of reporting him, but always their voices faltered, drowned by the unspoken truth. Who would dare accuse a decorated officer? The barracks became a place of tension, every man alert not only for drills and duties, but for the sudden storm of the captain's temper. Laughter was rare, camaraderie strained. The spirit of brotherhood, which should have bound them together, withered under the constant shadow of his presence. To the outside world, Captain Volkov was a model officer. To those beneath him, he was a tyrant in uniform. And though no one dared say it aloud, every soldier in that barracks carried the same unspoken hope in their chest that one day, somehow, justice would come for him. If Captain Adrian Volkov's arrogance and cruelty within the barracks were corrosive, the way he wielded his authority beyond its walls was far worse. Rank gave him not only control over men, but also access to privileges and powers that he twisted to his own desires. He was no longer just a harsh commander. He had become a predator cloaked in the protection of his uniform. There were rumors spoken in hushed tones that supplies meant for the soldiers rarely reached them in full. Boxes of rations would arrive sealed, but when opened, much was missing. Fuel, medical supplies, and even basic equipment disappeared like water in sand. The men whispered of Volkov's private dealings, that the missing goods were sold off quietly, through black market contacts in nearby towns. Of course, no one could prove it. Who among them would dare put their name to an accusation against a decorated captain? Some of the worst abuses, however, could not be hidden behind ledgers or paperwork. Private Daniels remembered the night he and his squad returned from a grueling border patrol. Exhausted, uniforms torn, faces streaked with mud and blood. Instead of rest, Volkov ordered them to clean his quarters. He barked at them to polish his boots until they shone like mirrors and to scrub the floors until he could eat his supper off them. Daniels, young and brash, muttered that they were soldiers, not servants. Volkov's response was immediate. He struck Daniels across the face with his gloved hand, the crack echoing through the narrow corridor. Then he ordered him outside in the freezing rain and made him stand at attention until dawn, soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably. Daniels developed pneumonia from that punishment, and though he survived, the cough lingered for months. His fellow soldiers carried silent rage in their hearts, but their lips never parted. Others had scars of a different kind. Corporal Singh once confided to a close friend that Volkov had deliberately sent his squad into a dangerous maneuver during an exercise, knowing the terrain was unstable. Singh's squad barely escaped an avalanche that could have killed them all. When Singh confronted him in private, Volkov smirked and said, "Maybe next time you'll follow orders without hesitation." It was not training, it was a game of power. A reminder that their lives rested entirely in his hands. The testimonies, if ever gathered, would have painted a portrait of a tyrant. Soldiers recalled being denied leave for family emergencies because, in Volkov's words, the army is your only family now. Some remembered being forced to stand guard for double shifts while he dined leisurely in the officers' mess, laughing with peers, untouchable in his arrogance. What stung the most was that Volkov knew he was protected. His medals, earned in earlier campaigns, and his powerful connections ensured that complaints, if they ever reached higher ears, were dismissed as discipline issues. Junior officers who dared to challenge him were reassigned within weeks. Their careers stunted before they even began. The message was clear. Adrian Volkov was beyond reproach. The law bent around his rank, and the system shielded him from accountability, and he reveled in it. But among the men who bore the weight of his cruelty, a slow, quiet fire began to grow. It was a fire stoked by humiliation, by loss, and by injustice. Though they feared him, though they kept their silence, they were not blind. They were watching, waiting for the day when his own arrogance would undo him. The barracks had become a place of unspoken misery, but as the months dragged on, cracks began to form in the silence that Volkov had ruled with for so long. Fear still lingered in every salute, every step, every hushed conversation, but beneath that fear, something else was growing. Defiance. It began subtly. Soldiers started keeping records, not official ones, but scraps of truth hidden in notebooks and folded letters home. Private Daniels, still haunted by the pneumonia he had suffered from Volkov's punishment, began writing down every order that seemed reckless or abusive. Corporal Singh quietly kept track of missing supplies, jotting down what arrived at the depot and what disappeared before reaching the soldiers. They shared nothing openly, but each man carried his secret ledger like a weapon, waiting for the day it might be used. Still, documenting abuse was dangerous. If Volkov discovered a single note, the punishment would be swift and merciless. So, the records were hidden beneath floorboards, tucked inside boots, or disguised as harmless letters about daily life. What had once been whispers of discontent began to transform into a hidden network of truth. The turning point came when one soldier, Lieutenant Marcus Hale, decided he could no longer stay silent. Hale was young but principled, a man who had joined the army not for glory, but for service. He had endured Volkov's humiliations in silence at first, telling himself that discipline was part of military life. But after seeing Private Keller collapse from dehydration during a forced punishment march, Hale's resolve hardened. Late one night, while the barracks slept, Hale sat at his desk with only a dim lamp for company. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote a detailed report, documenting not only Volkov's mistreatment but also the evidence of stolen supplies and reckless orders. He attached copies of Daniel's notes and Singh's records, gathered carefully over time. Every word he wrote was a risk. His career, his safety, even his freedom, could vanish if this report was discovered before it reached the right hands. When the report was complete, Hale sealed it in an envelope addressed to the Military Oversight Committee. The next morning, under the guise of routine duties, he slipped away to mail it through a secure channel, bypassing Volkov's watchful eye. It was an act of quiet rebellion, but in that moment, Hale knew he had crossed a line that could not be undone. For weeks, nothing seemed to happen. Volkov continued his reign, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath his command. But small signs began to surface: visits from higher-ranking officers, subtle inquiries, unexpected audits of supply shipments. The men who had once felt invisible now sensed that their voices, however faint, were beginning to reach ears beyond the barracks. Still, resistance was fierce. Volkov had allies, men in higher positions who saw him as a loyal officer, a man who got results by any means. Complaints were often buried, investigations quietly dismissed. More than once, Hale was warned by colleagues to be careful and let it go before you ruin yourself. The system itself seemed built to protect Volkov, not the men who suffered under him, but the whispers would not die. Each small piece of evidence, each testimony smuggled out, began to pile up like kindling. And though the system pushed back, the weight of truth was slowly tipping the scales. Among the soldiers, hope flickered, a fragile, dangerous thing, but enough to remind them that even the mightiest tyrant could one day fall. For all his arrogance and calculated cruelty, Captain Volkov believed he had mastered the art of control. His soldiers feared him, the system shielded him, and those who dared resist were silenced or reassigned. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the most cunning men. And it was that blindness that led to the incident that changed everything. It began with what should have been a routine training exercise. Volkov ordered a group of fresh recruits to march across a rugged stretch of terrain during a heatwave, fully armed and carrying packs heavier than regulations allowed. Experienced officers advised postponement, warning of heatstroke and exhaustion. But Volkov scoffed at their concern. "War does not wait for cool breezes," he barked. "If they cannot survive the sun, they are not worthy to wear the uniform." By midday, the recruits were staggering, their lips cracked and faces ashen. Private Keller, still recovering from past punishments, collapsed on the rocky ground. Instead of calling for medics, Volkov shouted at the boy to get up, his voice cold and merciless. When others tried to help, Volkov threatened them with disciplinary action. It was only when Keller stopped moving entirely, his chest barely rising, his skin burning hot, that the panic broke through the silence. Medics rushed forward, ignoring Volkov's orders to stand down. Keller was evacuated, but not before another recruit fainted beside him. That day, 3 young soldiers were hospitalized with severe heat stroke. One of them never woke again. Word spread quickly, first among the soldiers, then beyond the base walls. Families demanded answers. Keller's mother, her voice trembling with rage and grief, went to the press. "My son wanted to serve his country," she cried in front of flashing cameras, "not die because of a captain's cruelty." The story struck like wildfire. Newspapers carried the headline, "Recruits pushed beyond limits, 1 dead under captain's command." Advocacy groups that had long campaigned for accountability in the military seized the moment, demanding justice for the young soldiers. Social media erupted with outrage. Hashtags spreading the story far beyond the walls of the barracks. For the first time, Captain Volkov's name was spoken openly outside the base, not as a hero, but as a villain. The public demanded transparency. Families gathered at the gates with placards reading "No more silence" and "Justice for our sons." At first, the military hierarchy tried to contain the scandal. They released carefully worded statements, blaming unfortunate circumstances and training accidents. But the weight of testimonies, many of them secretly gathered by Lieutenant Hale and his allies, began surfacing in the press. Letters written by soldiers described years of abuse, stolen supplies, and reckless endangerments. The evidence was damning, and the outrage unstoppable. Television anchors asked pointed questions. How many complaints were ignored? How many young lives were ruined before this tragedy? Advocacy groups marched outside government buildings, demanding accountability not just for Volkov, but for the system that had protected him. Faced with growing unrest and a media storm that refused to die down, the authorities had no choice. An official investigation was launched, one that could not be quietly buried this time. For the first time in years, the fear that had bound the barracks began to loosen. Soldiers looked at one another with cautious hope. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now under scrutiny, and the walls that had shielded him were beginning to crack. Captain Adrian Volkov, the ruthless officer who believed himself invincible, was about to learn the hardest lesson of all, that power does not make a man immune to justice. The investigation moved with a force that even Captain Volkov could not deflect. Within weeks of the public outrage, the military command, under immense political and social pressure, had no choice but to suspend him from duty. His uniform, once adorned with medals that gleamed like shields against criticism, was stripped from his shoulders in a ceremony that felt less like discipline and more like exile. The man who had strutted through the barracks with iron confidence now walked away with his head low, flanked by military police. The trial that followed became a spectacle. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse each day, some holding photos of their sons and brothers, others waving banners that read "Justice for the soldiers." Reporters filled the benches, cameras clicked incessantly, and the air buzzed with Anticipation inside the courtroom. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Captain Volkov sat at the defense table, his jaw tight, his eyes darting with a mixture of anger and disbelief. For years he had been feared, untouchable. Now he was just another man in a plain suit, waiting for judgment. The prosecution wasted no time. Witness after witness took the stand. Private Daniels was among the first. His voice trembled as he described the night he was left standing in the freezing rain. Coughing so violently, he thought his lungs would burst. He said it was discipline, Daniels testified, his eyes glistening. But it was humiliation. It nearly killed me. Next came Corporal Singh, who recounted the reckless training maneuver that nearly cost his squad their lives. We begged him to reconsider, Singh said firmly, his gaze fixed on Volkov, but he looked at us like we were pawns in a game. He didn't care if we lived or died, only that his authority was unquestioned. The courtroom gasped when evidence of missing supplies was presented. Ledgers and testimonies revealed a pattern of theft and black market dealings. Witnesses from nearby towns described secret exchanges late at night, fuel rations, even medical kits sold for cash, while soldiers went without. Then came the most damning testimony of all. Lieutenant Marcus Hale, the whistleblower, stood tall as he faced both Volkov and the court. He described not only the cruel punishments and reckless orders but also the culture of fear that had silenced so many for so long. We were soldiers, sworn to defend our nation, Hale declared, his voice steady. But under Captain Volkov, we became prisoners of his cruelty. Speaking out meant risking everything. I could not stay silent any longer, not after the lives that were lost. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Even the judge leaned forward, listening intently. Volkov's defense tried to paint him as a strict disciplinarian. A man misunderstood, a soldier hardened by war. But as the evidence mounted, their arguments faltered. The testimonies were too consistent, the records too damning. When the prosecution projected photos of the hospitalized recruits' pale faces, for drips, the still body of the one who never survived, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. For once, Volkov had no words. The man who had once silenced others with a glance now sat mute, his mouth tight, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the table. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day peeling away another layer of his arrogance. By the time closing arguments were made, Captain Adrian Volkov was no longer the feared officer of legend. He was a disgraced man, his uniform forever stained not with battlefield dirt, but with the weight of his own cruelty. And as the court prepared to deliver its verdict, the world waited. Justice was no longer a distant hope, was at the door, ready to be spoken aloud. The final day of the trial arrived like a storm that had long been building. Outside the courthouse, crowds swelled, families clutching photos of sons lost or scarred, veterans standing shoulder to shoulder with civilians. Advocacy groups holding banners that read in bold letters, "No more silence, no more abuse." Reporters jostled for position, their microphones pointed like arrows toward the courthouse steps. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with expectation. Captain Adrian Volkov sat rigidly in his chair, his once proud posture diminished. Gone was the polished uniform that had shielded him for years. Instead, he wore a plain suit, a man stripped of the trappings of power. His eyes, once burning with authority, now flickered with a desperate hope that the system he had relied upon would protect him one last time. The judge entered, and the room fell into silence. Papers rustled, hearts pounded. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the entire courtroom stood as the verdict was about to be read. The judge's voice was steady, resonant, carrying the weight of months of testimony, evidence, and pain. On the charges of abuse of authority, theft of military property, reckless endangerment, and involuntary manslaughter. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, before settling on Volkov. "This court finds Captain Adrian Volkov guilty on all counts." The words struck the air like thunder. Gasps erupted from the audience. Some wept openly, others exhaled as though they had been holding their breath for years. Volkov's jaw clenched, his fists tightened on the table, but he said nothing. For the first time, the man who had commanded with fear, who had silenced countless voices, sat powerless in the face of justice. The judge continued, his words heavy with symbolism. "The uniform of this nation is a symbol of honor and duty. It is not a shield for cruelty, nor a weapon for corruption. Rank does not place a man above the law. Captain Volkov betrayed both his duty and his soldiers. Today, justice ensures that such betrayal does not stand unpunished." Volkov was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, stripped of rank, honors, and pension. The medals that once gleamed on his chest were ordered returned to the state, his name struck from the rolls of decorated officers. His legacy, once burnished with glory, now lay in ruins. In the gallery, families embraced. Keller's mother sobbed into her hands, whispering prayers of relief. Private Daniels squeezed Corporal Singh's shoulder, both men blinking back tears. For the first time, the heavy weight of silence that had smothered them for years seemed to lift. Outside, when news of the verdict reached the crowds, a cheer rose, a mixture of triumph and sorrow. For justice achieved always comes too late for some. Yet in that moment, the message was clear. No uniform, no rank, no power could place a man above the law. And though Captain Volkov was led away in chains, his downfall became more than just punishment for one man. It became a warning, a reminder, carved into the history of the military itself. Justice, though delayed, had spoken. The courthouse slowly emptied, but the echoes of the verdict lingered. Families filed out with tears in their eyes, some clutching photographs of loved ones who would never return, others holding on to the hands of soldiers who had survived. Their grief was not erased, but for the first time, it was acknowledged. Their voices had been heard. Captain Adrian Volkov's story ended not with medals, applause, or the respect he once demanded, but with the clinking of chains and the silence of disgrace. His fall from power was more than personal, it was symbolic. It marked the moment when arrogance met accountability, when cruelty was unmasked, and when justice proved stronger than fear. This case became a lesson for all who watched it unfold. Power is not immunity. Authority is not a weapon to wield against the weak. Every stripe on a shoulder, every star on a chest, every rank bestowed carries with it a duty to protect, to serve, and to honor the trust placed in it. When that duty is betrayed, justice will eventually find its way, no matter how long it takes, no matter how high the walls of silence may seem. And so the chapter closed with a truth as undeniable as it was necessary. Justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied. And most of all, no one is above the law.